Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest, who was formerly in an interracial marriage, is the author of the nonfiction book, It's Never Been a Level Playing Field, Overcoming 8 Racial Myths to Even the Field. His name is Steve Brigham, and my interview with Steve will follow the note-taking sounds. Steve Brigham, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you, Aaron.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
So I'm a community engagement consultant. I work with a lot of local agencies in the DC metropolitan area, planning agencies, transportation agencies, health, school systems, engaging the community and other stakeholders to weigh in on policy and plans that local officials have. And I've written a book and that was published in July 2024 called It's Never Been a Level Playing Field, Overcoming 8 Racial Myths to Even the Field. And so I'm delighted to be here to talk about all of the above.
Without spoiling too much of your book, which, as you mentioned, is titled It's Never Been a Level Playing Field, Overcoming 8 Racial Myths to Even the Field, what is it about?
So it's an intensive look at U.S. history as it relates to African Americans and whites, dating back to the end of slavery all the way until now, and taking a look in a lot of areas: education, the economy, health, environment, criminal justice, voting rights, etc., how that remained patently unfair throughout the Jim Crow time from 1865 to the mid-1960s, but how a lot of systems, policies, practices, and kind of even our culture has not really made the significant shifts needed to get us out of systemic racism, structural unfairness, and a playing field that is still not level.
What are some important issues and commonly held myths that your book addresses?
So, so the first myth is what I call the overarching myth. America provides an equal playing field for all. And I think a lot of us would like to believe that. I think, I'm 63. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. It seemed like, oh, well, we must be doing all the right things to create that level playing field. It's, we're the land of equal opportunity. But then when you look in my book in 2020, and you look across all the sectors in the private industry, public government, local, state, federal, the leadership in all of those sectors is 90% white, 95% white, 99% white, whether you're talking about, media or tech or what have you. It remains profoundly led and dominated by white people and honestly, mostly white men in, 60 years after the civil rights era. So how can we truly have an equal playing field? Because an equal playing field would lead to very different results and outcomes other than every sector being dominated by whites. So that's one. But I also look at what I call the where we live myths, which is any segregation in housing and neighborhoods that Black people may experience is now strictly a result of individual choice. And so the chapter there delves into our long legacy of segregation, the intentional creation of ghettos, the redlining of Black neighborhoods that still has major legacy effects in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century, where it remains difficult to really create integrated neighborhoods. Most neighborhoods, are not integrated in the way that I think was imagined back in the 60s and 70s. So, and so I explore that in each of the different myth areas. It's the access to economic opportunity myth. Everyone, regardless of color, has the same opportunity to get a job, start a business, and build wealth. And yet, Black adults are paid significantly less than white adults at every educational level, every level of educational achievement, whether that's high school diploma or it's graduate degrees. The pay for Blacks on average, is about 20% less than it is for whites with the same level of education.
How did your background as a white man who was in an interracial marriage with a black woman for many years influence how you wrote your book?
It had a huge influence, honestly. I mean, so I moved well, first of all, let me just step back. So I grew up in an all white town in Simsbury, Connecticut. But I had some profound experiences growing up where my dad started a program that brought inner city Black and Hispanic teenagers to my town to go to school there for 3 years, sophomore, junior, senior year. When I got to high school, I became good friends with three African American teenage boys, and that had a huge impact on how I began to see the world. And yet, I went away to college, went into the workplace from the late 70s to the late 80s, and my experience was very white, where I lived, where I went to college, the jobs I had. And when I moved to DC in the late 80s, I made an intentional decision that I was going to get to know a lot more African Americans, befriend African Americans, hang out with African Americans, befriend colleagues that were African Americans. And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey when I moved to DC in '88. Married my ex-wife, now ex-wife, in 2000. Had two biracial kids. She came from rural North Carolina in a town that's very segregated and still very white dominated in terms of public and private sector. And got to know many of her family who still live in that area. Others who move to DC and have kind of struggled, and so it had a profound impact on kind of seeing the world through their eyes, hearing their experiences, widely ranging, whether it was with police or with getting jobs, getting a good education, etc. And during that whole time, I also really tried to get much more well versed and well read in issues around race in America. Um, so ultimately, when the pandemic began, I had this itch to write something significant. Wasn't sure it was going to be a book, but even 2 months into it, it took me 3.5 years to write and edit. I knew I had a book, and it was just kind of a matter of how I was going to put it all together in some kind of coherent way. And having two biracial kids and seeing how they navigate the world and what they're exposed to and what they have to confront. My daughter is a senior in college. My son's a high school sophomore, and just getting them ready to be, a person of color, an African American, a biracial adult in America that is a better place for them than the 1960s, but where they still have to contend with a lot of racism, bigotry, microaggressions, as well as, policies and practices that may disadvantage them.
We've already elaborated a bit on this, but how is America still a racially unequal country today? And in what ways do white people, particularly white men, still have privilege over or compared to black people and other non-white people?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, that's a complicated question. It's a great question. So, I just mentioned about how Black adults are paid less at every level of education when they're out in the workforce compared to whites. So that's significant. Just keeping on economic issues, the Black unemployment rate in America, still today, and dating back to the 1960s, has always been twice what it is for whites. So when it was 6% for whites, it was 12% for blacks. In recent years, right, where the unemployment rate has come way down, I think now it's probably somewhere around 4%. It's about 2.5% for whites and about 5% for blacks. So even today, we see significant disparities around employment and unemployment, even though it's about the same rate of labor force participation between Black adults and white adults. Um, Another area with regard to schools, so where people live, 45% of black students attend a high poverty school, which is often a low performing school, compared to 6% of white students. So white students in general go to higher performing schools and don't have to confront, all the issues related to being in a higher poverty neighborhood. Um, 60% of black residents live in neighborhoods with one or more waste or major polluting sites. This is kind of an environmental racism, environmental injustice, which is many more times than what white residents are exposed to because of where they live and because of laws and policies that had been on the books dating back to the 1920s about what could be put in white neighborhoods versus what could be put in black neighborhoods and other neighborhoods of color. Black children are 5 times more likely to suffer from lead poisoning. Black adults 3 times more likely to die from asthma. Again, a lot of that has to do with where they live, what they're exposed to, kind of the sources of pollution that are around them. The wealth gap is 10 to 1 between whites and blacks. And it's the same ratio, 10 to 1, as it was in 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So, I mean, I can go on and on with statistics. I think the challenge here is um, not to beat white people over the head about, oh, look at how much privilege you have. And honestly, some white people like myself grew up in a upper middle class, went to a really good public school system, got well educated, went to a good liberal arts college, had access to white dominant networks throughout my career to kind of connect me to jobs and positions as I moved up the food chain. That is very much not the experience of too many African Americans. It's also honestly not the same experience of whites who grow up in lower income households, right? Like if you live in rural West Virginia or Ohio or Kentucky or places in the deep South, your perception of having privilege is very different than someone who was raised like me, right? And so, one of the interesting things, I'm reading a book by Reverend Barber called White Poverty. The stereotype up for poverty and someone who's poor is that it's a black person or person of color, but the majority of poor people in America are white. So, white privilege is distributed differently across the white population. It's not kind of every white person has the same privilege as the next white person. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's my first stab at it.
Before I ask you the next question, I'll let you know you referenced Dr. William Barber, the
Correct.
North Carolina Moral Mondays leader.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. It was a major effort he did across the state of North Carolina. And to his credit, it was a moral fusion campaign that crossed kind of racial lines, right? It was white, black, Hispanic, etc. And he picked up the reins in recent years from Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign from the 1960s. He now has something, I think it's called the New Poor People's Campaign, where again he's really advocating with again across race, even across kind of economic status, for policies that really are needed in this country to get more and more people out of poverty.
And regarding the book you wrote, are there solutions to the issues you address in your book? And if so, what are some solutions that you would recommend that policymakers and or others in society adopt?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I'll say is when I introduce the solutions section of my book, I say that I'm a supporter of reparations, which has been in kind of the political mix for decades, if not longer. I still believe that American society will not go forward with that. There was a poll done 3 or 4 years ago where it was something in the order of whereas about 85% of African Americans were supportive of some form of significant reparations, more than 70% of whites were not. And so, in that kind of political environment, social and cultural environment, I just don't see reparations happening the rest of my lifetime. I expect I'll hopefully live another 20, 25, 30 years. So I said to myself, so what can we do in the areas that I talk about in the book that would be potentially transformative and definitely more transformative if they're done in combination with one another? So I look at four areas for solutions. One, transforming the education landscape for our African American youth. So I look at things like funding universal birth to three, as well as pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 programs, so that we make sure that far more African Americans, no matter where they live, and especially if they live in high poverty environments, have access to the learning, developmental, and educational tools to go into school ready to succeed, ready to thrive. Significantly increasing federal Title I funding of Title I schools, which again are typically schools in higher poverty environments, providing a Black New Deal for African American high school graduates. So when we think about the New Deal, we think of profound transformative policies that Roosevelt laid out in the 1930s that were implemented. And here's where kind of white privilege it was extended back in the 30s and 40s. Most Black people did not have access to the New Deal programs. They were basically for white people. And so it helped a lot of white people out of poverty. It hardly helped any Black people out of poverty. Same with the GI Bill, predominantly focused on white GIs, not Black GIs. And so I believe we need some kind of Black New Deal, which would say whether you're going on to a trade school, whether you're going on to a major university or anything in between, America will pay for your post-secondary education to make sure that you can move up the rungs of society in a way that up until now has been absent for too many African Americans. So, there's more in the education section than that. Right now, so I write a newsletter on the platform Substack that's tied to my book. It's called Leveling the Field Finally. And right now, I've been focusing the last few weeks on transformative housing policies. So, how do we look at building far more housing? How do we change the zoning in our localities so that far more affordable housing can be built? Because, just like white people, but even more so for Black people, people are cost burdened housing wise, where they're spending 30, 40, 50% or more of their income on renting a house, renting an apartment, getting some place to live. And so we need to build far more housing. We need to build far more housing that's affordable. We need to change our zoning laws about where that housing can be built, which will also contribute toward greater racial integration of neighborhoods, which has never really occurred. So again, I do the same thing around transforming pathways to economic prosperity, looking at baby bonds for all newborns, guaranteed basic income, massive investments in workforce development and training, and then a significant chapter on shortening the arc that bends towards full racial justice. So just looking at very significant reforms, whether that's around policing, around sentencing, around probation and parole, et cetera, et cetera. So I tried to go into some detail in each of the areas I covered in the front end of the book to say, so what can we do? What should we do? What would make a real market difference?
The next two questions are about your writing and getting your book published. What are the easiest and hardest aspects of writing a political nonfiction book for you?
Well, I can only speak from the experience of this one book. And up until probably 4 or 5 years ago, I never would have seen myself as a book author. The pandemic gave me the motivation and the confidence to give it a shot. Um, I'm not a fiction writer, right? So I don't know kind of that side of things. I think for someone who maybe say a professor at a major university in a particular field, much easier because you're paid to do research, you're paid to teach these ideas, so kind of writing a book comes easier to you. What I would say is I understood what my passion was. I understood what I was deeply concerned about. And the idea for my book was if someone like me really was never exposed to a lot of this stuff, our history in particular and the policies that made our society so unlevel, a lot more people need to be informed of this. So I was really motivated by, especially how do I help expose to far more white people that history, and therefore, what is it that we owe African Americans after everything that we've done to them? So that was my motivation. I wrote steadily for the first 14 months and had a full manuscript, got feedback on it that I had to really kind of think about shortening it, overhauling it, rethinking it, and then spent another year and a half writing kind of the second and final version of it. And then, I did shop around to some traditional book publishers, and essentially they wanted to know, well, how big is your audience on X? How big is your audience on LinkedIn and on other platforms? Where else have you published a book, et cetera, et cetera? And so I realized that the kind of the traditional publishing arena is really not for someone like me who, has not well established myself as a thought leader in this area. So I decided to self-publish. I worked through a company called selfpublishing.com. It was a significant financial investment for me to go with them, but uh, you know, they gave me the kind of the methodology and the key steps I needed to take, and access to the people that I needed for editing and graphic artwork, et cetera, et cetera, and kind of held my hand over the last really 7, 8 months of the process. And then once I had a book, I began to realize that if it was ever going to sell, all of the marketing and promotion was on me. No one else was going to do it for me except for, people in my network helping me get the word out. So, I've been trying to figure out in the 6, 7 months since it's been published, where are the avenues for getting the word out about the book? So podcasts, Amazon ads, um, you know, setting up an account and advertising on Goodreads, book party. And then for me, the most significant thing is launching a Substack newsletter. Substack being, I think, the largest writers platform out there now, and trying to grow my audience through my regular writing about issues that are connected to the book, um, and also cross posting on LinkedIn, where I have about 1,600 people that I'm networked to.
You actually answered the next question I was going to ask you, so I'm going to skip ahead to the final question of this interview. What is your work as a facilitator, consultant, and designer of complex public meetings and community building processes on critical public policy issues like?
So this is a field that I've been in for 25 years. So I started with a national organization called America Speaks, where I was chief operating officer for 13 years, where we did community engagement on key policy issues. Again, think about whether it's education or health or land use or transportation or higher education. Organized and facilitated meetings all across the country. Also did some stuff internationally, including in Europe, where we did a kind of a multinational effort around both biodiversity and another one on brain science. So I've been exposed to lots of different issues, lots of key thinkers, influencers, stakeholders. But when I left America Speaks, I decided to work with two colleagues who were employed there with me. And for the last 11 years, I'm based in the DC area. We decided that all the community engagement we would do, or at least would pursue, would be in the DC, Maryland, Virginia metropolitan area. And so we've gotten to do great projects in kind of all of the counties around the region, in the district itself, worked with mayors, council members. And so, this is really where the rubber meets the road, and what I began to realize in the latter years at America Speaks and throughout my entire tenure here at Public Engagement Associates, so many of the issues that we were asked to come in and get the public's input on really had ties to racial inequity, racial injustice, the legacy of racism, because we're dealing with localized issues like land use, zoning, school boundaries, public health disparities, et cetera, et cetera. And that very much informed and influenced my increasing concern about where we were as a region, as a nation, and helped kind of lead into the writing of the book. And in the book, I kind of thread through examples of the issues that come up in some of these projects that directly tie to the myths that I'm talking about and the solutions that I'm proposing.
Steve, it was very wonderful to interview you for this podcast. I thank you wholeheartedly for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Aaron, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your great questions. I also appreciate giving me the time to talk about my book and my background. And I wish you well in your future endeavors with the podcast.
Steve was an amazing guest to interview, and I will include a link to his Substack newsletter in the text description of this episode. Sometime tomorrow, I will be making all of my non-podcast videos on the Apollo Papyrus channel on YouTube private, as I will be completely relaunching the channel next month. This will not affect the ability to listen to the Apollo Papyrus podcast episodes on the Apollo Papyrus channel, as I will keep a full archive of the podcast publicly available on YouTube. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.